Launch get here on November 3rd. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what else was I going to do last year other than, write every day?
So good afternoon, everybody. We are now live on camera. So thank you very much for coming out to the National Book Launch for Dana's new book, Disappearance of a Scribe, which, as you can see, is a really beautiful book. It has a very nice map inside. It's this publisher, who is British, does a gorgeous job actually making physical books, I think. There's a map, a really useful map. And there is section breaks are actually the scarab that you see on the cover. So in many ways, these books are fun to buy just because they are so gorgeous, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the second in the Eye of Isis series. And as Dana's just told you, the third one's already written and will be available on November 3rd when Dana will be back, amazingly, back in Scottsdale to talk about it. And it involves tomb robbing. What's the title of it?
It is called Theft of an Idol.
Ooh,
which is not what you think it means.
Very true. And while the camera can't see it, this is Dana and me on location, descending into a pyramid in Saqqara, not in Giza, but in Saqqara, where we experienced firsthand the thrills of being tomb robbers, except there wasn't anything left in the tomb.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. All the better tomb robbers had gotten there before us.
Indeed so. So in Disappearance of a Scribe, we are in 47 BC, and this is the reign of Cleopatra the Seventh, and she is the last pharaoh of Egypt. When she eventually commits suicide after she and Mark Antony were defeated at the Battle of Actium, that was the last of the Egyptian pharaohs, and Egypt became ruled by Rome. So Julius Caesar, however, has wandered in and out of this series because when he came to Egypt, he and Cleopatra got together and had a child who, in theory, is going to inherit Egypt, but tragically, he doesn't survive either. So, it's in a way, it's really sad to read these books knowing it's like the end, of a many thousand-year multiple dynasties. This dynasty was really descended from Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy. So not in the line of all the Egyptian pharaohs, but nonetheless, Egypt. And, looking at it today as a desert country, I don't know that we realized that it was the breadbasket of Rome. It was an incredibly fertile province. The Nile was inundating every year. The Aswan Dam has put an end to the actual Nile inundation every year, and it's led to a great many problems, particular difficult problems for the animals in the Nile, because the hippos and they can't now go up and down the river like they could before the dam. And to the south of Aswan and the major dam, the river is actually a lake now, Lake Nasser. And so if you go all the way to Abu Simbel, you're not really on the Nile. Well, you are on the Nile, but the Nile is a lake. So the time of the cataracts and so forth that you think about, Death on the Nile, if you've read it, Agatha Christie stayed in Aswan at the Old Cataract Hotel, and then they went south. It's a reverse, right? We're all used to rivers going from north to south, and it's hard to remember that it goes from south to north in Egypt, so I'm always going the wrong direction. But the cataract, that kind of a voyage that they took in Death on the Nile, you can't do it now. Things have changed. And now with the big battle between Egypt and Ethiopia about the water, because Ethiopia has built a major dam on one of the two rivers that feed the Nile, which is going to make a big difference. And it's the same thing that China is doing on the Mekong and other rivers in Asia, is that they are building dams within China that are going to totally alter life for those people downriver. We have the same issue in Arizona with the Colorado and, California and the whole bit. So I do believe people have said that it's very likely that the Third World War, if there is one, will be over water rights more than anything else, because water is becoming increasingly scarce, but not in the time of Cleopatra. And so this book is actually like on the waterfront. Any of you remember Marlon Brando and that wonderful movie? Well, this to a great degree is a waterfront kind of a battle except that it's in Egypt in Cleopatra's time. So Dana, why don't you take over and talk about your inspiration for Disappearance of a Scribe?
I have a friend named Karl Marx, a childhood friend, known him my entire life. Was in love with him for a while in high school. He looked very nice in basketball shorts. And he is one of those visionary guys who goes and finds things to do that nobody else is doing that are obviously beneficial basically to all of us. And specifically to his tribe, the tribal organization, the Quick Inlet Region Incorporated. Right now, he's working for the Old Harbor Native Corporation, and he's come up with something old is new again, something called pozzolan or pozzolano. It's a kind of a cement that they used back in the day, back in Roman and Cleopatra's day. If you've ever been to Italy and you've been to, what's the name of the place in Rome?
The Forum?
Yeah, no, not the Forum. There's a building there that was made with pozzolan that, I mean, you still can insert a thumbnail in between the stones 2,000 years later. It's astonishing. It's no surprise to me, really, reading up on pozzolan, that there are still aqueducts standing and the ancient buildings of Rome are still standing. I mean, those guys built to last and they knew what they were doing. Pozzolan in particular is an extremely good cement to use in waterfront properties like docks because it doesn't deteriorate as normal cement does in seawater. And it's coming back now because coal mines are shutting down and they don't have the material, the byproduct from coal mines to make normal cement. So they're going back to pozzolan. And so Karl was telling me all about this, and I'd never heard of any of this. I didn't even know what he was talking about. So of course, always after I have a conversation with Karl, I have to hit the books and find out what the stuff is. And so I Google pozzolan and I talk to some people and I read some books. I find out about this guy named Vitruvius, who you'll be familiar probably with the name, the Vitruvian Man, because he came up with the picture of the guy with standing in the circle, the golden triangle, I think is what they call that. It turned out that Vitruvius never drew that, or there isn't anything existing to show that he did, but Leonardo da Vinci did. Actually. So Vitruvius was a very famous guy. Even back in the day, he was an engineer who came to Egypt with Caesar's armies. By an engineer, that meant that he built siege agents to throw things at city walls to knock them down. And so I sort of incorporate him into the story of pozzolan because in Cleopatra's time, this is right after in 47 BC, Cleopatra's just had the baby. Caesar has left. She's busy rebuilding the city of Alexandria because, wars. And so I thought to myself, well, construction materials. And at the time they were using pozzolan, which my friend Karl has just informed me of. And I thought, okay, so we all have heard the stories about how crooked, big city contracting is. There's no reason in the world that I can't incorporate that into a story at that time because, things just don't change that much as far as people are concerned. The technology changes, but the people don't. So, and as soon as Karl told me about pozzolan, I immediately thought about cement overshoes. Everybody's heard of that, right? Everybody thinks that's Jimmy Hoffa got fitted with a pair of cement overshoes and he's in Lake Michigan now or whatever. So I thought to myself, well, okay, they wouldn't be wearing overshoes in that time, but they would certainly be wearing sandals. So I came up immediately with the idea of ricotta sandals as a means of murder. And there are a couple of spear fishermen in Alexandria Harbor that are fishing, and they come upon this horrible sight of a body it's upright because it's weighted down by the ricotta sandals. And so, and then Tedasheri, who is the Eye of Isis, she's basically Cleopatra's personal and private investigator, is called to the scene because there's a political aspect to it, and we take the story from there. There's also a subplot about book thieves stealing books from the Great Library of Alexandria. So, and there you go. I had a really good time writing this book. It was a lot of fun. It drove Barbara crazy because it was kind of her idea she said, you need a subplot. She said, you seem to really love the library. It should be something to do with the library. Well, that was easy. You know, I Googled book theft and I came back with almost 7 million hits. So not a stretch, you know, really.
Right, except at the
Yeah.
Great Library of Alexandria, almost all the books were scrolls. They weren't, codices as we are used to. But Dana and I actually spent an afternoon, too short an afternoon,
Way
at
too
the
short.
Library of Alexandria. We didn't allow for the traffic pattern in the modern, well, we didn't, our guide didn't, in the modern city of Alexandria, which of course is a great port. It's at the mouth of the delta, the Nile flows down and then it branches out into many channels. And ancient Egypt was governed more upstream. Memphis was the capital and Thebes was the capital, so farther upriver. And in fact, the original capital, I think, was way up at the first cataract near Aswan. But eventually, because trade with the Mediterranean is becoming more important, Alexandria is a major port. Now, some of you may or may not have read about part of Alexandria has fallen into the Mediterranean. And
The good part.
a lot of it, well, not just the lighthouse of the Pharaoh, but other parts. And when I was in London a few years ago, my husband and I went to see an exhibit at the British Library, which was all photographs of the sunken part of the city of Alexandria, which is really quite extensive, and of the rooms and so forth under the water. So Dana's right, the pozzolan is like an impervious cement. They're still in place. I find cement to be interesting because at one point, when Poison Pen Press was still, I was still the acquiring editor and so forth. We've sold it since, so I'm not doing that anymore. But we had a Roman series, and you always worry in historical fiction that anachronisms will creep in. And for some reason, when I was reading it, I thought, cement, that sounds so modern. Really? So I look it up. And in fact, of course, it precedes Roman. It's a very ancient thing. But then, if you've ever been to Dublin and you want to see the Book of Kells, if you go to the university there's a building with an archaeological exhibit, and the entire front of it is cement over the ages. They have examples of all different kinds of cement and how it's made and what the composition of it is, and which ones are more lasting and all the rest of it. So I know more about cement than I actually ever intended to know, but it was helpful in looking at it. I'm the editor, the first editor of Dana's books, and for some time now. And so I couldn't help but think of that, thinking about the university library and then looking it up in Rome and so forth. But I have to say that only Dana could actually make a whole book inspired by cement.
Because that's just how I roll.
Really interesting. So in order to really understand, how many of you have read the first book in this series? Have all of you read it? No. All right, well, then you might want to go back and explain the whole setup about Tedasheri and the Eye of Isis and how she became this particular agent of Queen Cleopatra.
She's a childhood friend of Queen Cleopatra. She and Aristander, who's the head of the Shurta, who are the local police force, they all went to school together in the royal school. And I think it had a lot to do also with Elides, Cleopatra's father, eyeballing who he wanted his daughter to be friends with, because he chose Cleopatra early on as his heir. And so in my fictional world, I am positing the notion that Elides was looking out for Cleopatra well before he died and she assumed the throne. She's at the beginning of, what's the name of the first book? God, jeez. No, Death of an Eye. Oh my God, shoot me now. Anyway, at the beginning of Death of an Eye, Cleopatra is heavily pregnant. Julius Caesar is still in town, and the current Eye of Isis, who is every pharaoh in my fictional world, every pharaoh, every one of the Ptolemies has had their own Eye of Isis, because every leader has a hatchet man. Every corporate, president everybody's got a hatchet man. So the Eye of Isis is the designated hatchet man for every pharaoh, and sometimes they have more than one. Anyway, so the current Eye of Isis is discovered murdered on the street in Alexandria. And of course, Cleopatra calls for Tedasheri, her childhood friend, one of the few people she can actually trust, and says to her, find out who did this. Of course, the long game that Cleopatra is playing it's basically a test for Tedasheri to see if she could be the next Eye of Isis. At first, Tedasheri doesn't understand this. She's just going to be doing this job that she doesn't want to do for her buddy. And then, of course, at the end of the book, Cleopatra offers her the job. And, if Cleopatra offers you a job, probably you're not going to say no. Not a good idea. This is her second case. And it begins in the library because, as Barbara correctly pointed out, I do love the library, any library really. And she's reading past cases of, she thinks, she doesn't have any history investigation. She doesn't have any on-the-job experience. She's a trader. She's, in partnership with her uncle, and they import goods from all over the Mediterranean and even as far as Punt. At that time, they called it, Punt is India. And she doesn't know from anything. She's just doing a favor for Cleopatra. Well, now the job is hers. How does she learn? She goes back and she reads past cases. There's a secret room in my fictional world. There's a secret room in the Great Library of Alexandria that is dedicated to past records of eyes. I love this series. God, I'm having such a good time with it. And I think I told you before we started rolling too that I've written the third book in the series. It's called Theft of an Idol, and it will come out in November of this year. So I'll be back to sign that.
Oh, when she says secret room, really is very limited access, there does need to be some kind of a record. Well, there doesn't need to be, but there is some kind of a record. And so there's a librarian whom you haven't mentioned at the library who's really a very...
So Sigenes, yes. I sort of snatched him up from the pages of history. He's the guy that helped Julius Caesar write the new calendar. Yeah. So, and he eventually later on does go to Rome. But for now, he's the librarian at the Great Library of Alexandria. He's basically, the internet for Cleopatra and Pediceri of that time.
So is he Greek or is he Roman?
He's Greek.
He's Greek, right? Because, you have to remember that there was a real mix that, and oftentimes the more scholarly people were Greek. So, and Ptolemy was a Greek general, so it actually is a Greek dynasty in Egypt, not a Roman one. And, one of the great ironies of the whole bit about the Ides of March and killing Julius Caesar to prevent him from becoming the strong man of Rome is that it absolutely paved the way for Augustus to become emperor. So by assassinating Caesar, they actually made that thing happen.
But we're not there yet.
We're
not there yet.
But we all know that from history. Shakespeare alone, et tu, Brute, and all the rest of it.
I had a.
You have to keep that in mind.
Well, no, I don't.
No,
I don't have to. I don't have to keep that in mind. No, Cleopatra's still alive. Julius Caesar's still alive. The first book begins in May of 47 and ends in September of 47. The next book takes place in October, and this book takes place in, I believe it's November. I'm pretty sure that's how it worked. There's going to be plenty of stuff for today. There's plenty of time for. A fan wrote to me and said, "Do you know that they're looking for the tomb of Cleopatra?" And I said, "She's not dead yet. Stop that."
She isn't dead yet. Actually, those are the missing tombs: Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and Alexander. Their tombs
Underwater.
have never been found.
Probably.
And so there's a lot of interest in this new technology like LiDAR and so forth. That is able to. As you know, they have found a village on the west bank of the Nile down near
Hierapolis.
It's now Luxor. I'm trying to remember, near Thebes, whatever it is, where they have found all kinds of new tombs and interesting stuff. And God only knows how much stuff is still to be discovered. And LiDAR may be a big help in finding it. But certainly, it would be a really amazing thing if there were a tomb for.
Every 5 minutes, they're finding something in Egypt that they never saw before. It's fabulous.
Yeah. No, it really is. But because I'm trying to remember, what was Cleopatra's whole reign? It wasn't all that long. Was it
about
30
20
years?
years.
20 years?
It was about 20 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
she dies in 30.
all right. So you can move along month to month.
So I got 13 years.
You can. One of the advantages of historical fiction is you don't write it in real time because it's already too late for that. So, the Michael Connelly problem of aging Harry, out of the LAPD, or Ian Rankin doing that, or various other authors that have faced that. Nevada Bar, remember Anna Pigeon, how wonderful those were? She got too old, to do the kind of stuff that that she did, that whole ranger, slithering around in caverns and killing grizzlies with her bare hands and all the rest of it. She couldn't really do it anymore. But in historical fiction, you don't have that issue. Any of you read Lindsay Davis's wonderful series with Falco? They were set in ancient Rome. The second case literally starts 5 minutes after the first case ends. The silver pig stops, and then the what's
Venus
it? Bronze.
and Copper.
No, it's bronze is the second one. Venus and Copper is the third one.
Yeah.
But
that's my
whatever the
favorite.
anyway, they start literally within minutes, of the conclusion of the previous case. And in historical fiction, there's no reason that you can't do that. So Dana doesn't need to rush her way through Cleopatra's
I haven't.
reign.
I'm working on something else right now that will come out in probably April or May of next year, and I'll talk about that after we're done talking about this. And then I'm going to go immediately back to the Eye of Isis series and write the next 3 books in the Eye of Isis series. Probably Nick is going to commit suicide if he hears me say that.
But don't commit yourself too heavily, because things keep alternating. That's your design. But we always have to be flexible because we don't know how things are going. So anyway, back to cement in the port. Alexandria is a huge port. Up the river is a place called Syene, which is not to be confused with Cyrene, which is the port over west of Egypt
Libya.
on Libya, right? So Syene is a major port, and so there's a lot of traffic up and
Aswan.
down the Nile. Yeah, from Syene to, and stuff comes out of Africa. I mean, most of the gold is in fact not in Egypt. It's up in what we
Nubia?
call, now it's can't remember what we call it. It was called Nubia then. What's
Ethiopia,
yeah, but what's the country right south there? I'm sorry.
Eritrea.
I'm having the Sudan. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, senior Roman. Right. And so there was, and also, trees like ebony and all that kind of stuff, had to come downriver, and it was really dangerous to go around the cataracts. In some cases, they may have portaged some of this stuff, rather than risk it on the rocks. When we were there in Aswan, this was the place where they were making some of, remember Cleopatra's Needles, some of those gigantic
Granite obelisks.
the obelisks, and they lost a bunch of them in the river.
They
I
rolled
mean,
off boats into the River Nile.
yeah, and
They're
so-
sitting at the bottom of the River Nile now.
So they may eventually be reclaimed, but they show you one that was enormous, and the craftsmen were so careful with it and the whole bit, but unfortunately there was just enough of a flaw in the stone where it cracked. So it's still there. In the giant quarry, there is this beautiful obelisk that has this fatal crack that they didn't move out. Anyway, all of this stuff has to go down river, so that's why I'm saying it's sort of like on the waterfront, because if you're on the river, you have to have crews, you have to have sailors, but you have to have whatever stevedores, whatever you want to call them, people, this before containers, right? So you had to have people that are unloading, offloading the boats, and inevitably, when you have that kind of traffic, what's the thing that you think about? Smuggling, right? Right? Clandestine transportation of
You
goods.
also have to have, and even then, there was a difference between ordinary cement and pozzolan. Everybody who was building on waterfronts wanted the pozzolan. That was the stuff that you wanted to build with. It was going to be exposed to the seawater or the sea air. That was what you wanted if you wanted stuff to last. I mean, if you were building a lighthouse like the Pharos that was going to last, another 400 years until the earthquake took it out, you wanted the very best cement, the longest lasting cement. So I posit the notion in the book that Cleopatra requires a guard. That is not a very good guard. And Tedashuri is worried that she's going to get them all killed at one point.
So, and if you think that is, not really a problem, think about the condo building that collapsed in Florida, because that's exactly what happened is that the salt water, the interior metal, the steel, whatever it is, the rebar and the cement deteriorated because of the
Everything old is new again.
yeah, the pernicious effect of salt water is, really dangerous. So anyway, we have, possibilities of great corruption, possibilities of informers wearing cement sandals, whatever it might also be. But you also have profiteers. So, you can keep your eye peeled for all of those in the book. But one of the other things that Dana does is, in order for Tita Sherry to do her job, if you think of her as sort of Sherlockian, what is it that Sherlock Holmes puts together to help him in his investigations? The Baker Street irregulars, right? So the field is ripe.
Yeah, there's I can't even remember where this idea came from. I'm sure it wasn't original with me, but there's no internet. It's not like you can email back then, but there has to be a way to move information, right? So I posit the notion that on every street corner there's a group of kids that are ready to run errands for you. You give them a drachma and off they go. And so she is basically commandeered on a street corner, and she's not about to get by somebody she doesn't know. And she's not about to get into the cabrio that this guy says, yeah, sure, I'll give you a ride. Want a piece of candy, little girl? And so she goes around, she turns around and she goes back to the street corner and she picks out a boy and she says to him, go to my house and tells him how to get there. Tell my family I am with this guy and I will be home for dinner. So off he goes. Well, a little later, she is kidnapped, a little later in the series of the books. And this kid, whom she has tipped very well, sees it happen and follows her and helps her escape and then helps her follow the villains that kidnapped her. And then she winds up with, I think it's 5, if we're going to be calling them Baker Street. We're not calling them the Baker Street regulars in the book.
No.
But she's wound up with 5 pages is what she's how she tells her uncle. And oh, by the way, we've increased the household by 5 more mouths to feed. They're going to form part of her, what she calls the owlry.
Yeah, but no, it's a really important thing, to have a messenger service. Basically, if you go up to New York, you can be mowed down by a bicycle at any second anymore. Have any of you been in Manhattan since the pandemic? Well, I was really shocked. There's always been a terrible car traffic issue, and pedestrians have always been at risk. Now, where you're at risk, if you step off the curb, you're stepping into the bicycle lane. And those guys are not paying any attention to the normal driving rules. And I mean, it's really dangerous. They are electronic bicycles by and large, and they're delivering pizza, they're delivering food, they're delivering cosmetics, whatever it might be, or just delivering papers. So, every city, I think, since the beginning of time has had some sort of messenger service, whatever it might happen to be. And obviously, street kids would be a great, and they're kind of invisible as well, because they're kids and they don't look. I'm trying to think, who's that funny woman that writes? Lynn Truss has a couple of books set in Brighton in the 1950s, and she in fact has. I love the conceit that the woman who's the cleaner, the charwoman, as they say in Britain, but basically the cleaning service lady in the police station is actually the head of the local crime syndicate. So she's perfectly placed, right? But her lookout is a kid selling electric rabbits, little rabbit, things bunnies that run off batteries and all. And he stands on the street corner, fairly near the center of the city, with his tray full of electronic bunnies. And he's like info central and dispatches, information also. I mean, it's a great and totally believable idea.
Everybody needs help.
Yeah, well, but you got to get information, all around, and you also need somebody to watch your back. So you said cabriolet, so why don't you describe that?
Well, that's a word I made up. I was looking for,
It's
I was trying to find, well,
It's
not
a real
necessarily.
word.
It's Italian. Not
Is it?
cabriolet, cabrio.
Oh, okay. All
Cabrio.
right.
I don't go cabriolet. Anyway, so I can't imagine for a moment. The Alexandria was an enormous city of about, best estimate, 500,000 people at the time in which I am writing. And it was a beautiful city. The recreations that you see, the maps of Alexandria, I mean, broad boulevards, with lanes. And so I thought to myself, okay, there's going to be people driving as well as walking down these. So they're going to have different lanes. It's going to be controlled. And then you have to think about, all right, what are they driving? And I couldn't find a source close to the time as to, other than the word carriage. And that just seemed so Victorian to me. That didn't work for me. So from cabriolet, but also an Italian word, which I cannot remember right now, I came up with the word cabrio, and that's the main means it's taxi. It's basically the Alexandrian taxi. It's a cabrio, and that is the sixth mouth that Sherry decides that we haven't had she and her uncle went away on a long trip and basically, closed the house down while they were gone. And so turned loose the cabrio that they had at the house cabrio they had at the time. So now in this book, she acquires a new cabrio.
So is this a horse-drawn?
A horse-drawn,
Conveyance?
yeah, a horse-drawn.
Right.
It's a chariot. It's basically a chariot with a seat. It's not the chariot where the driver can either stand in back or in front, and then there's a seat on which the passengers sit.
Right, because they had war chariots. I mean, you can see those in tomb carvings and other stuff.
Well, that was how Egypt fell the first time. Wasn't the Hittites?
Yeah.
Showed up with the chariots and wheels.
Just like the Spanish
ran right
in
over the
Peru.
Egyptian troops.
Yeah, just like the Spanish in South America. The Inca and all, they never developed the wheel. So they never had chariots or anything, and the llama was not a strong enough beast of burden. The backs of llamas are too weak, so they had to come up with a whole system.
They ran.
For it. It was basically people running and, that kind of thing. But certainly in Egypt, where there were no reason not to have. And the Romans, all of them used horses and chariots and
Pretty
so forth.
flat, Egypt. Pretty flat.
It is, except at Giza. Any of you have seen, the Great Pyramids? They're actually up on a platform on purpose. It's a granite platform, and it's just beyond the edge of where the Nile rose. And they built them there because if the Nile had inundated, they would have, rotted out whoever was buried in the pyramids. So they had to move west of it. Giza's not in Cairo. Giza is west of Cairo, over the west bank of the Nile, and up on a natural granite. They didn't make it with pozzolan. It was just a natural granite thing to prevent the floods from reaching inside the pyramids, which is why the Valley of the Kings is away from the Nile and the Valley of the Queens, so the river couldn't pour in and wreck all that stuff. It's really interesting to go see it. I mean, I think, we were lucky that we got a chance to do that.
I read the first book without going to Egypt, and I told Barbara, I said, there's no way, I got to go before I read the second one, before I write any more books in Egypt. I mean, I'd done all the research that I had to go see with my own eyes. And I really wanted to see Red Land, Black Land that Barbara Hertz wrote about. Barbara Hertz, some of you
Mertz.
will remember. That's what I said.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said Hertz.
No, well, it's Hertz.
Mertz.
Oh, Mertz, sorry.
Right. That's okay.
Okay, Barbara Mertz wrote about, you'll know her by her, if you've read the Amelia Peabody Mysteries. It's, Elizabeth Peters is her Amelia Peabody name. But she was also a fine Egyptian scholar, and she wrote a book called Red Land, Black Land that has been absolutely invaluable. And I took a balloon trip up out of Luxor early one morning, basically so I could actually see the Red Land and the Black Land. And the Black Land is what fronts the Nile, because that's what's watered and that's where they grow stuff. And then the Red Land is just nothing except sand and rock in every direction as far as you can see. So, I mean, maybe a little. The sand is more gold here. It's more red there. Yeah.
I think. So that's probably all we can really tell you about the book without spoiling it. It's a lot of fun to read it. I agree with Dana that the third book is really exceptional because it has, I mean, who of us doesn't love the idea of a treasure hunt and tomb robbing and all that good stuff, right? Influenced by the fact that we actually descended into a tomb, which was really cool. I still can't believe we did it.
I told Barbara, and she said, when she read the book, when she read it, she said, man, that sounds really real. And I said, it was really real, remember?
Going down is hard. Climbing out of it wasn't too bad, but you start way up in the side of...
you have to climb way up
on
to
the
go
outside.
way down,
Yeah.
and then go
And then
way
down
up
you
to
go.
come out, and then way down.
Indeed. It was amazing. Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered, how do you come up with all the different names of your characters?
Excellent question.
There are tons of websites out there with ancient names. There's one in particular that and I'm not going to be able to remember the URL for you, but it's got a whole collection of ancient names: Roman, Egyptian, Italian, every ethnicity that you could possibly imagine. And I look at that, and there's some other sites as well I haven't bookmarked. So when I need new names, then I go there.
There's a lot of material once they cracked the Rosetta Stone, cracked the reading of hieroglyphs and so forth. There's a great body of work, either chiseled into walls or whatever it might be, where they name people. The pharaoh names are in what they call cartouche. They have like a frame around them. But there was a kind of alphabet of hieroglyphs, and then you could read about all the the courtiers, the families, the whole bit. They kept records. Most great empires keep records, don't they? I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I remember going to Istanbul, going to the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, and seeing a small cuneiform. One of the exhibits is a cuneiform tablet. It's about this big. I mean, it's the tiniest little chicken scratch language you can possibly imagine. And I'm peering at it, and then I finally see the talker, the shelf talker at the bottom. It's the account of a murder trial in, I don't know, God, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago. And they're making, keeping the record about this guy, who, whatever it was that he did. I would love, I'd love to see a translation of that.
It would be great. The biggest records are always in the tax department. They had to keep, no, I'm serious. They had to keep track of, what properties everybody owned and the royal revenue streams and taxmen and so forth. So they usually had very good records. And in order to do that, you had to have the names of the property holders and, the families, whatever it is. There's a great series called the Mamre Zap series by, I'm trying to think of his name. And they'd all take place during the Egyptian control of Egypt. So basically the 1870s up through the First World War, when Egypt was a protectorate, basically colony of Britain, and they had a shadow government that ran it and the whole bit. And when you read it, the importance of the tax records and the property records are enormous. They even had surveyors back in the old days, right? To figure out who owned what. So anybody have any questions they'd like to ask besides the name question before we wrap up?
One thing I wanted to add to the subject we were talking about, maybe you'll be interested, maybe not, but I'm fascinated by all this stuff, compelled to share. Egypt was a bureaucracy for a long time. I mean, they had pharaohs for 4,000 years, and then they had Ptolemy kings and queens for 300 years. So they knew how to keep records. And one of my main sources is Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra. And one of the things that she says in that book that probably inspired this series more than, even the character of Cleopatra herself and the actual history was the fact that because there was this enormous bureaucracy, it was, of course, liable to cheating and, stealing and, everybody getting their take and stuff. But that the one institution, Schiff says, that was largely incorruptible was the cops. The police force. I love that. I love that thought.
Patrick, did you want to have a question from the audience?
Exactly, yes. Would you mind repeating the question just for the people?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, Lisa, they may be able to hear me. Lisa asks, if you had Cleopatra over for dinner, what question would you ask her? And what would you like to know about her that is unknown?
So what question would Dana, if you had Cleopatra for dinner, what question would you as the host want to ask her?
There wouldn't be even one question, really. And could I compel Her Majesty to answer truthfully? I mean, there's that to be taken into consideration as well. And what's the one thing I don't know about her that I would like to know? Oh, God, what was going through her mind just before she committed suicide? I think I know. I think I know. There's a big story about how she's just having hysterics all over the place. And some historians speculate that the reason she's doing that is she's putting on a show for the Roman soldiers, including Augustus, to maybe, engender their sympathy so that they'll let her live and remain as queen of Egypt. I don't necessarily, I wouldn't put it past her. I mean, this was a pretty crafty lady. And I would not put, her thinking that way. I wouldn't put it past her. But I also think she was pissed off She didn't have much choice in seducing Anthony. You know, Anthony, Lepidus, and Octavian, they cut up the Roman world into three parts. Anthony got the eastern part. The eastern part, Egypt was in the eastern part. Anthony was the guy on the ground with the legions. So she invited him to Egypt. She seduced him, you know, to her purpose. And basically he was her man, you know, up until the very end. And she really didn't have any other choice. You know, one of the things that I do in my books is I posit the existence of an Egyptian army that she is fomenting, that she is getting, you know, she's getting Egyptians, not just Greeks, people in Alexandria to join. But as I point out in the second book, it's not a very good army. And she was never going to be able to hold her own. She was always going to have a strong man at her back. And I would love to know what was going through her mind those last moments.
I would love to know, you know, about Actium because there were some strategic errors. But if she and Antony had won the Battle of Actium, that would have changed the whole course of history. It was that defeat that put the end to her reign, and she and Antony died as a result, and Augustus was unopposed. But I've often wondered who was in charge and, you know, who decided the strategy.
There were people defecting from Anthony right, left, and center.
Were there?
Yeah, they were just like, I think this is that feckless loser. I think maybe he might have had one good battle in him, maybe one good speech in him, and that's about it. I don't have a lot to say on Anthony's behalf. I'm sorry. Not my favorite character at that time.
Right.
Question from Ginger online. She'd like to know. She appreciated the food descriptions in the first book. And will there be more of that in the second book? And can you describe basically some of the common foods they were eating?
So what foods are present in the second book because they were so good in the first book? And what was the kind of common diet?
Beans. Seriously, they grew and ate a lot of all kinds of beans. They really did. Protein. You know, it's a good food source, and we're supposed to be eating more of them now. Any nutritionist will tell you that. But yeah, lots. And there was a lot of citrus as well. There was a lot of citrus.
Fish, especially
And of
in
course fish,
Alexandria,
yeah.
because it was
Yeah,
there.
because it was right there. And I actually had to look up, there was something like 57 different kinds of fish in the Nile River that you could eat, that they were constantly fishing. Don't ask me to name any now. There weren't any salmon, I'll tell you that.
So Rome exacted as tribute from Egypt and what they called corn, but basically corn is a grain. And so there was a lot of bread. You can still, when you go to Egypt, they actually have beehive ovens where they, you know, slap the, what looks like
That's
pita
all
bread.
over, that's actually
All
all
over
over,
the
it's
Middle
all over
East.
the Middle East and
But
the Far East.
There was an excellent series written by a woman whose name I've now forgotten. They were paperbacks, but anyway, they were set at Aswan at the First Cataract. With a,
I remember you told me about that.
yeah, they were really
Yeah.
great. Lauren Haney, her name was. Unfortunately, they were out of print. But anyway, what you learned from that was that beer was an enormous source of not just drinking, but calories, and also because the water was not pure. You know, if you put and what they did was they took all this bread and they made beer out of the bread. It was like almost instant beer because, you know, it fermented so rapidly. But that was true all over the world for a really long time. The Romans liked wine. They could grow grapes, but their wine is not necessarily the kind of wine we think about. So in your book, there's a fair amount of wine going on, but you know, regular people drank beer, and that could actually have been their breakfast. Small beers,
small beer. And I would say to Ginger as well that the meals that I describe are generally taking place in wealthier households, so their diet would be much better and much more varied than the average person.
Yeah, but you can see on the walls of tombs, you can see their bird
Oh,
hunting,
God.
their duck hunting. Their duck was a big thing.
Remember all the stuff that we saw, all the little carvings on the walls? There would be like lines of tribute of people carrying bread and, you know, ducks and, I mean, everything, all the food in the tomb to sustain the dead person, the dead pharaoh, into the next life.
And oxen. I mean, you can see, you know, Hathor was the cow goddess. So they had bovines, and they were obviously able to, I can't remember any pigs. I don't remember pigs at all, but they
Yeah.
definitely had access to some kind of bovine, you know, to beef.
Anything you could milk, goats. for
Yeah,
starters. Yeah.
right. But a lot of birds were part of their diet as well. And presumably, if birds, they might have been eating eggs as well. I don't recall seeing eggs, but one would think that eggs were a
I would
real
guess.
possibility, duck eggs in
Nobody
particular.
pointed out any trays of eggs to us. That doesn't mean they weren't there.
But there were some of the tomb paintings, they actually would depict food. I've got some photographs of them, and, as I say, grains and fruit, and coffee hadn't come up from Africa at that point. I don't remember any mention ever of coffee in anything about ancient Egypt.
I
you?
think it was post-Roman, certainly.
Yeah.
I think it was like, I would say,
I think so too.
what we call the Dark Ages, what they certainly didn't. But around then, I would think.
Hard
It came
to
from
imagine
Ethiopia
a world
originally,
without
I
coffee,
think.
It's like
But I
every
don't
morning.
have to know about that because that's not now, or not what I'm writing about. So.
Right. Anyway, lots of fun stuff. So any other questions anybody might like to ask? It's really fun to go back to a different place, isn't it? And imagine how people lived and the accommodations they made, and also how much like us they were, and yet how different.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for Crime Reads. I think it's a British crime magazine. I'm actually not very sure about that. I don't
No,
think
I
I've
don't
ever
think
even
it's
seen
not
a
British,
copy
I
of it.
don't think.
So my British publisher said these people wanted me to write something, so I did. And then somebody else wanted me to write something, and I said, I just don't have time. I have to come down and talk to you people. So anyway, but one of the things that I told him, I said I wasn't quite out of ideas yet, but that a piece that I did want to write was about the similarities of the people then and the people now. The main difference is the technology. And it's 2,000 years of technology. This is not an inconsiderable amount of technology, I grant you. Nevertheless, those are still human beings back there living human lives, just like we do. So it's fun to look at their life through their eyes.
It is indeed. It's really a treat.
And I'm sure I'm getting a ton wrong, but it's still fun.
It's fiction. Right. So, it's probably more important to enter into the spirit of it than it is to be deadly accurate. And
There's a Facebook group called I don't know, it's the Roman Reading Group or something. I'm getting the name wrong. Don't kill me. And they invited me, and they plan ahead, those people. So about 2 months ago, somebody emailed me from them and said, we see that you're writing, history set in this time, and we're interested, and you want to come talk to our book group? And I said, sure. And they said, well, how about October? And I said, well, sure. This was September. And they said, no, October next year. So and I live in fear of what that's going to be like, because those people are going to know all the places I fudged in all the books.
it's okay. You can talk to them about climbing into a tomb, and
Yeah.
they will not be able to quarrel with that. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. Dana will be delighted to sign your books. It's getting a little late to wish you all a Happy New Year, but I will still do that. I get to go almost all the way through January. What's that?
1 through 10?
Oh,
1 through
right.
10.
Oh, we have prizes.
Yes, I have
Sorry.
prizes.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
PK. You reminded me. So
Yeah.
to some of you, do you have numbers with your books? Is that what you? So we have
Yes.
numbers 1 through 10.
1
so
through 10.
you can use those. Thank you, PK, for saving us there. And thank you, Patrick, very much for doing the video.
Thank you.
Pleasure
So
as
this is
always.
basically a 3-for-1. I've got 3 things to give out of 3 things. So there's 3 different mugs here, and then there's just to dress it up, we got a little keychain here that's Egyptian themed. And then I found these on the Met website, the Metropolitan Art, and it's a little scarab bracelet because of the scarab here. I'm already wearing mine right here. So number 3.